The environment is never neutral. So the room a child walks into every morning is actually already communicating something to their nervous system.
When I was 3 days old, my parents were told, don't expect that I will live, that there was absolutely no hope that I would live.
So many of the children sitting in our rooms have already been living in survival mode long before they walk through the door.
They need to fall in love with the environment, and then they fall in love with learning, basically. And the adults in the room and the other children in the room are part of that environment.
The conditions that children need to learn are not separate from the conditions they need to feel human. The first 5 years of a child's life shape everything that comes after. And the people most responsible for those years, the educators in the room, are often the least supported people in the building. That gap is something that we have personally felt. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that early childhood educators know, and it goes deeper than the physical tiredness of days that ask so much of our bodies. It's the feeling of caring profoundly about this work, of knowing how much the early years matter, and still not having the community, the space, or the recognition to grow into the educator we know we're capable of being. Parent App built this podcast because that gap deserves an answer. My name is Dana Al Qinneh. I'm an early childhood educator with nearly a decade of experience, a former central principal, a mother of 3, and head of pedagogy innovation at Parent App, a childcare management platform working with over 70,000 educators around the world. A few years ago, we started asking ourselves a bigger question. What if the platform wasn't just where educators managed their day, but where they grew as professionals? That question became the Early Years Academy, and this podcast is where that question gets to breathe. This space is built for the people who show up every single day for the children in their classrooms, in their centers, in living rooms, in community halls, in school corridors. It's for the educators who give their everything, and for the directors trying to build something meaningful, and for the practitioners who are quietly hungry for more and needing support. The conversations on this podcast were chosen because they speak to something that matters. We talk about how the brain works, how trauma and safety and relationships all intertwine, about culture, identity, and belonging, about pedagogy and best practice, and about the environments that we build and the presence we bring to them. It takes a village to raise a child, and this is your village. Early childhood education is the most serious work there is, and we believe that the educator in the room, you, are everything to the children who walk through the door. This podcast is for you. I'm so glad you found us, and I hope this becomes a place you come back to. Hi everyone, welcome to the Early Years Academy podcast. I'm Dana Al Qinneh, your host, and today we're starting with something I believe sits at the very core of early childhood practice. The environment is never neutral. So the room a child walks into every morning is actually already communicating something to their nervous system before a single word is even spoken. So it's either saying to the child, you're safe here, or it's saying something else entirely. Most of us in early years know that the environment matters. We've read about it in frameworks, we've attended workshops, we've rearranged our shelves and loose parts and our lighting. But far fewer of us actually understand why it matters at a neurological level, and that's exactly where today's conversation begins. Our guest today is Dr. Kathryn Murray. She's the creator of Brain Set Environments formula and the founder of Future Strong Education based in Australia, but working with educators across the globe for over 4 decades. Her framework grounds classroom design in how the brain actually works, specifically the tri-brain model, where safety, emotional connection, and thinking each correspond to a different level of the brain and require different things from the space that we build. So what drew me to Kathryn's work is that when I placed Brain Set alongside trauma-informed practice, I kept seeing the same principles showing up, but in different ways. So the same conditions that a child's nervous system needs to feel safe enough to learn are actually the same conditions that good environmental design is trying to create. So that felt like a conversation worth having out loud. Kathryn, welcome to the Early Years podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Dana. It's lovely to be here with you and have this conversation because it's such an important conversation, and the work you do within trauma informed practice is pivotal to what we do as well. And I think what I'm about to talk about is really a lovely marriage of the two concepts.
Absolutely. So before we get into the framework itself, I wanted to start at the beginning. So you've been in education for over 40 years, and at some point you were seeing something in classrooms that told you a new way of thinking was needed. So what was that moment, and what were you noticing that said the way that we were designing spaces wasn't quite working?
Well, I want to take us back a little bit further, actually, back to when I was a baby, which I'm not going to start my life right from the beginning, but I'm going to tell you a story that I think might sort of set the tone and give you a little bit of context. Because when I was born, I was a normal, healthy baby until about 3 days after I was born, and then I had a brain bleed, which meant my brain was hemorrhaging inside my skull, and my skull started expanding and expanding bigger and bigger. Doctors tried to syringe all of the extra blood off, but it kept bleeding for some reason. When I was 3 days old, my parents were told that don't expect that I will live, that there was absolutely no hope that I would live, and I could either go home with them and I would die, or I can go into some sort of facility and they would provide that for my parents, but I would die. But anyway, my parents decided to take me home and nurtured me at home. I had two brothers and a sister at home, and I was the youngest of four, and so I was looked after. And for the first couple of years, my milestones were a little bit slower, so I crawled a little later, I walked a little later. But by 4, I'd pretty much caught up to everybody else, to my peers, and here I am today. So I didn't die. But I look back, and when I heard that story, and I looked back and I thought, well, what is it that helped me to survive, and not just to survive, but to thrive? I went into teaching, and I was always working with young children. I was a classroom teacher for 25 years, and then I went into the university sector. And when you're an academic, you have to be involved in research, and the research that I was involved in was neuroscience and brain-based environments. When I was in the classroom, I used to play around with the environments quite a lot, change things around and just watch and see where the children would go and what particularly helped them to gravitate to different learning spaces than another. Even some that I had taken ages to set up. Sometimes the children just didn't even go anywhere near it, and I was thinking, well, what's wrong with this? It looks so nice, but what's wrong with it? So when I went into academia, and I started to work with early childhood student teachers as well, and primary or elementary student teachers as well. And again, we were talking about the environments, and I brought in a bit of this neuroscience that I was learning about. When I established my consultancy business, I was working with a lot of early childhood services and centres, mostly in Australia then, and I was speaking at a lot of conferences, and the conferences were both overseas and within Australia, and I was talking very much about the built environment and how important it is that we think about the environment that we're establishing for children. And we all know about Reggio Emilia and the environment being the third teacher, and that was sort of in the back of my mind, as well as Montessori's teachings and a lot of other research. So I was talking about that, but I was also talking about the importance of considering the development of the brain as well. But at that stage, there were two silos of thinking. The environment's important and the brain's important. I did a presentation for an audience in Texas about 7 years ago, or thereabouts, 7 or 8 years ago, and it was an online one, and I just did my presentation, and that was the end of that. But about a month later, I had an email from someone in America, and she said that she'd never heard anybody speak about these two elements and how that they were intertwined. And she'd sent me an article, and she thought I might like to read it. It was about setting up classroom environments for children with autism. And at that stage, I wasn't really looking at that sort of side of things. I was still trying to figure out, different ways to put the environment and neuroscience together. So anyway, I printed it, put it to one side, But a couple of weeks later, I was going to a coffee shop, and so I picked up the article, took it to the coffee shop for something to read. And as I was reading that document, all of these pieces that I already had sort of circulating in my head fell into place. And there was one element that was missing. And as I was reading this document, some of the words jumped out of the document. Not so much the document, but the words. And everything fell into place for me in a coffee shop in Queensland, in Australia. And of course, I had nothing to write on. I went there for a coffee. So I got some paper napkins or serviettes, and I was writing on those, and because I didn't want to lose my ideas. And I got home and I developed what I now call the Brain Set Environments formula. And it is about blending what we know about neuroscience and the developing brain to a specific way of designing our classroom spaces that align to what I call the 3 levels of the brain. And you mentioned that before about the different 2 levels of the brain, and I've sort of massaged that a little bit so it suits Brain Set and suits the 3 pillars of design.
What I love the most about your brain set is how it actually translates practice or translates into practice. So the brain set, you were telling me, is built on 3 aspects, right? So there's the survival, the emotional, and the thinking. That's what makes up the set. But can you walk us through, can you walk us through those 3 levels and what it actually looks like when a classroom is only activating survival mode, for example, or what does that room feel like? And most importantly, what does that child in the room feel like?
Well, it's interesting that you mention what it looks like for the child and if the child's only operating in one level or the other. Because what I have seen as I travel internationally and across Australia working with educators is that often the survival part of the brain hasn't been taken care of. So with all best of intentions and care, we set up our learning environment, so our classroom, in a way that we think looks nice, we think it's practical. So we put the easels over near the sink because it's easy to clean up the paint pots. We put the construction space, the big blocks, over on the corner on the carpet, so no one knocks them over. We do all of these practical things. And we hang things, and we have nice soft couches often, and we do things so that we think the room is looking nice and it's inviting for the children. And most of the time it is. Unfortunately, sometimes those rooms, with the best of intentions, don't actually meet the needs of the brain. So when we think about this, we think about the survival part of the brain, and as you just said, Dana, it's the S, the E and the T. So the survival part of the brain is the brain stem. The emotional part of the brain is in the limbic system in behind the ear. And then the thinking part of the brain is at the top in the neocortex and the prefrontal cortex. So those 3 levels of the brain harmonise and need to align so that we can think. So my mantra is a calm brain is a thinking brain. And the first thing we have to do is make sure children have a sense of safety, because that's feeding into that survival part of the brain, the lower part of the brain. So they need to have a sense of safety, and that means they can look around the space and they know the ceiling's not going to fall down on them. They know the walls aren't going to collapse onto them. They know that this furniture isn't dangerous. There's no sharp things on the furniture. That they look at the people, and the people are sort of nice and smiling, and they have a sense of safety in this space. Then we move up to the next level, to the emotional part, and then we need to make sure that children feel safe, which is different. Feeling safe, feel like they belong, feel like they're valued, feel like people want them to be there. And they do that by, again, looking around to see if it seems familiar to them, it feels comfortable. There's people smiling at them, there's people talking to them, there's people saying, oh, I'm so glad you're here today. All of those sorts of things are now feeding into the limbic system. So we've got the sense of safety, now we feel safe, and then we can start to think because everything's clear, and we can remember, and we can make really good decisions, and we can problem solve and communicate well. All of those things happen easily when we've got those 2 bottom levels of the brain harmonising. The third one just sings. The difficulty is sometimes the environment doesn't say what we think it says, because the environment speaks. And it actually dictates how we feel, how we think, and how we act. So if we walk into a space now and we don't have that sense of of safety. It doesn't look like it's a good place. So there's lots of sharp edges and sharp corners. And so there's that sense of, maybe it's not quite safe here. So then there's a little bit of cortisol injected in the top part of the brain. And then we look around and it doesn't feel safe. Someone's raising their voice, or we've got lots of chaos. So there's lots of children running around the place, and it just doesn't feel safe. So now we have a brain that is going into trauma. Or trauma that they've already had is now being triggered because there's not a sense of safety. They're not feeling safe. Cortisol is being flooded into the brain, and now we don't have a calm brain. Now we have a confused brain. So we can still think and talk, but not as clearly. We can still make decisions, but not as well. We can still remember things, but not as well. And we find communication difficult as well. So when we set up our environment to make sure that we're addressing all of those levels of the brain, everything calms down. Children calm down. We've got in our rooms, we've all got hypersensitive children, so children that are super sensitive to sensory stimuli. And we've got hyposensitive children who just want more and more stimulus. They want that finger paint, and they want it up their arms and in their hair and all over the place. They want that. So we have children that need different things in our environment. So now we have to align what we know now about the brain, the 3 levels of the brain, to the 3 pillars of design that I've developed too. And you mentioned those before too, Dana. We've got the survival pillar, the emotional pillar, and the thinking pillar. And within each of those are elements of design. So different things we need to have in our classroom space that all overlap together to make one lovely, brain-friendly environment. So it's not segregated, it's just the whole space is this lovely space that children can thrive in.
Right, and cohesion. So actually, in trauma-informed practice, we talk about the same thing, but from a relational angle. So many of the children sitting in our rooms have already been living in survival mode long before they walk through the door. So there's could be adversity, instability, unpredictability at home, whatever the reason, their brainstem is already on high alert. And so the question then that the environment has to answer the moment they arrive is this place safe, as you mentioned? And the physical space actually either answers that question or it doesn't, long before we have a chance to open up or greet the child or to say anything. And I think that's where so many well-intended rooms miss the mark. They're beautiful, they're stimulating, they're full of color and invitation, but then neurologically they're loud. So this brings me to something I actually really want your perspective on. What are the most common design mistakes that you see in early years settings? The ones that look right, as you mentioned, the ones that educators are proud of, but then they actually cause dysregulation without us realizing it.
There's a few things. That's quite a loaded question, because there's a few things that I see. In fact, I did a professional development session with a group of early childhood educators just yesterday, and then worked with them to move things around in their room so that it was more conducive to thinking and brain set. It's a brain set room now, and some of the common mistakes that I see, and I saw yesterday, was that people tend to might make small defined spaces, but they put them against the wall, and they have almost like a corridor down the middle of the room, and the children see that corridor, and of course the environment speaks, it tells you what to do, so the children see the corridor, but they see it as a running track. So now the children are running through the room and running to different spaces, and sometimes the teachers don't see that that's the reasoning behind it, because the children just see it in a whole different way. Another common thing, and this has to do with furniture that is commonly bought too, is that we often have square or rectangular tables with sharp edges, sharp 90-degree edges, which aren't really sharp. But to the brain, and a child's brain, it's a point of danger, because when you think about a child, their eye level is probably pretty close to the height of that edge of the table or the edge of the shelf. So for the brain, there's this little bing of cortisol, this little spike of cortisol, because they see something that's potentially dangerous. And of course, logically, we know, we just walk around the shelf or we just walk around the table. But there's already a little bit of a ping of cortisol that has been released, because the brain is looking for danger, because the brain's job is to make us survive. So the brain is looking for things that might be a threat to us. So that's something that I often see too with the, and that's just a furniture build thing. Often teachers don't have much control over that. So the other thing is, I guess we don't use enough round things. So there's solutions to those things I've just told you. There's solutions to that and as part of the brain set classroom. So round things help, because now we've got a rounded curve, and that is calming for the brain. So if we have some round tables, and even if you do have those square tables or those rectangular tables with those hard edges, put some round placemats on them or some round bowls, things that are softer, and that helps to calm the brain down as well, because it feels a lot easier, a lot calmer. Or if you can't do that, move the tables to put them on an angle, so they're not all lined up in rows, and because then it looks quite clinical and hard and fast, like there's no flexibility in the room. But if you twist things just slightly to an angle, that gives a softer perception to the brain, and it also allows children to feel like it's more fun in that space. Yeah. Children want to go into the classroom environment and have it feel familiar and comfortable. So we want to make it home-like. We want to have a couch, we want to have soft lights, we want to have lamps, we want to have floor mats, we want to have nice cozy things, and these small defined spaces which are only for 1, 2, 3, 4 children, maybe 6 at the most, and that might be in the block construction area. So we want to have multiple small defined spaces, because being in a little space is less threatening as well. Children can be more focused, they can be more engaged, they can have a greater sense of success because they're using the open-ended materials that are there in front of them. And it feels very calm. And all of the children are in these nice little pockets all throughout the room. So behaviour issues decrease, oral language increases, because there's not the threat, or, we're not in a big room anymore, we're in these little pockets all the way around the room. And so as the teacher, it's a beautiful time for the teacher too, because everything is calmer, and the teacher can now become a facilitator and move around all of these little pockets of children and ask these really great questions, like the critical thinking questions. So I wonder what would happen if. How do you know what would happen if we did this? What would happen if we took the wheels off that truck? How would we still get it to work? All of those great questions that teachers have got time now to talk about with the children. And the other thing around that is that teachers' brains become calmer. And one of them, when I first introduced Brain Set, it was one of my first trainings actually in Brain Set. And one of the teachers from a 2-year-old's classroom came to me the following week for the next lot of training with this big smile on her face. And I said, "Oh, you must have had a really good week." And she said, "I have had the best week." She said, "The children are more engaged. They stay at the spaces a lot more than they were. They've calmed right down. The room's calm. We hardly have any children crying." And she said, "And I've got time to talk to my colleague about what we can do next, what other provocations we can put out for the children, or what other things that we can create for them." So they have time, and they were calmer too. The parents noticed it. So the parents noticed the children were calmer, the room is calmer, the lighting is different. So there was a whole lot of additional things when I first started doing this that I hadn't really expected. And that calmness with the adult educators, that was one of the things that I wasn't expecting. But since then, I'm told that regularly now, that it's just so calming that it's easier for everyone to think.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you talk about the children's reactions, but also the educators' reactions. So I remember as a principal, I also had these classrooms that I was drawn to. At the end of the day, when all the teachers have left and I had a few paperwork left to do, there's certain classrooms where I enjoy taking my laptop, sitting inside and working in. And there were certain classrooms where I'd avoid, And it comes down to what you said. when I walked in, was the space inviting? Did it look like a home? Did it, ask me to stay a little bit longer? The smell. So I remember certain classrooms had, a very distinctive lavender smell, because the teacher would always make sure she put lavender essential oils in the Play-Doh. And there were certain classrooms that smelled very sanitary, right? But then again, that's a problem, right? I don't associate the sanitary smell with very good memories, right? So yeah, I love how you talked about two of those. The one thing that I want to come back to is how a child's nervous system isn't actually just reading the room, so it's also reading the person standing in it. So my question then is, can a space be perfectly designed but still feel unsafe to a child simply because the adult inside is maybe carrying something they haven't processed? And if that's true, where does environmental design and educator regulation begin in the other end, or are they intertwined?
Yeah, absolutely. All of those things. A child really can pick up. We all can. We can all pick up when the energy is wrong in the room, or that there's something going on that doesn't quite feel right. We have a vagus nervous system that goes from our amygdala, so where all of our emotions are housed in the brain, or part of our emotions, and it goes down behind our ear, and it's a direct line straight into our belly, into our gut. And when people say, what's your gut feeling about this, or, I feel it in my gut, or if you feel a little bit anxious, your tummy starts to rumble, all of those things happen because this amygdala up here is this amazing little organ that can pick up the energy, can pick up feelings way before the logical brain has figured out that, oh, this isn't a good space. So when we think about this ourselves, when, we've all probably been in situations where you've been somewhere that's unfamiliar and you walk up a dark street, or you go into a room where, you don't know anybody and it just doesn't feel right. Or you start to talk to somebody and you think, there's something a bit off with this person. It just doesn't feel right. That's the amygdala picking up on those signals. So we can all read that, and children are really good at that because they don't have so much, brain chatter going on in their mind. They're not thinking about, what am I going to cook for dinner, and did I get the laundry put on? They're not thinking about all of that. They're just, clear thinking. So they pick up on those emotions much easier than we adults do. Sometimes adults can, think it away, that we can be too logical and think, oh yeah, it's just this or it's just that. But children can pick it up like animals do. They pick it up. They pick up the energy. So absolutely, you can have a beautiful room set up, but if the people in it aren't one with the room, it doesn't match, and children will know that. So they're going to feel a little on edge. They're going to feel a little pressured. They're going to be sort of a little bit on high alert, not really knowing why things don't match up. So yeah, we need to be mindful of that too. And I think the second part of your question was about the adult's brain, and that works for the adults as well. We need to make sure that we put ourselves in a situation where we can make sure our brain is calm, and if it's not calm, we need to do something about it. So either change the environment or change the people that we're with, so that we can all have a calm brain, because a calm brain is a thinking brain.
I love how you started answering that by talking about predictability, and when there isn't predictability, again, the danger alerts kind of go off. And trauma-informed practice, we talk a great deal about predictability, and I think educators often think of that as being, related to the routine and the schedule and the rhythm of the day. But what you were naming is actually spatial predictability, right? That's what I heard. And that a child should be able to look at a room and know where they are. They should know where to go. They should know what's theirs. And there's this direct line between physical predictability and emotional predictability. And I don't think we talk about that enough.
Yeah, I agree. And there's another aspect of that that we call wayfinding, and it goes to what you were just talking about, Dana. And wayfinding is this predictability, but it's the emotional and the physical predictability sort of blended together. Before I mentioned when some teachers set up their classrooms, they put all of their spaces, all of the little areas against the walls, and there's this big corridor. We don't want that. We want to imagine that the classroom is like a meandering river. So we want to dot these spaces through the room. So as a child, you have to sort of meander through and sort of, go like in a curvy sort of way, like a nice, soft, gentle river. And that allows children to be able to almost bounce from one space to the next, to the next, to the next, and they can see what's coming up. They can see where they've been behind. There's no big shelves that's blocking the view. They can actually have a good vision of where they're going to go, and as they meander through the room, and that's called wayfinding. And it's really important, particularly for those children who have experienced trauma. It's okay for the adults because we're up taller and we can see over the top of shelves or things that might be blocking a child's view. But for a child, we need to get down low. So for anyone that's listening at the moment who is in a classroom situation, my suggestion for you is to tomorrow go to your classroom, get down on your knees at the door and have a look and see what the children see. And see if you can see this wayfinding that goes through your room. See if you can almost bounce off from one space to the next. And then go into the middle of your room, do the same thing, get down on your knees and then look around in a 360 direction. Can you see things from all of those spaces, or is your vision blocked? And if your vision's blocked, does that mean you have to put something on an angle, a shelving system on an angle, or can you move it around a little bit so that things aren't blocked so much, so that children can see where they're going, they can wayfind, and they can have that predictability and that sense of safety and security that they need in the survival part of the brain. That's what we need to address first, and then we'll worry about moving up.
Yeah. You actually use this phrase that I love ever since I heard it, which is create small rooms within the larger room. And I'd love for you to paint us a picture of that. So what does that genuine autonomy and security look like, especially for a young child? Not just having a cozy corner for the sake of it, but something that actually serves neurological purpose.
Well, if you think about it, if a child wasn't in the classroom, if they were at home, with their parents for the day, they would have access to maybe 8 rooms, all purpose-built. So there'd be a bedroom, there'd be a kitchen, there'd be a living room, there'd be a bathroom, all for a purpose and all intentionally built. So to make our classroom spaces more home-like and feel more comfortable for young children, let's break our rectangle or our square, which is our classroom, let's break it into small little rooms, basically little rooms within the room. And we can do that by using plants to divide little spaces. And remember, I said they were small defined spaces, so a space just for one, and that space could just be a table up against the wall with some sensory materials on it, or a little writing space. Spaces for 1, 2, 3, 4 children, that might be around a table. But there's plants dividing things up, or you can get a material called organza that's a really lightweight, almost see-through material, and you can hang that from the ceiling down so it sort of makes a fake wall. There's different, or use your furniture. There's different ways to divide the room up into these small little spaces. And yes, I think traditionally we do always have the reading area where there's cushions or there's a couch or something. We have a reading area, and then we have the easels for the painting, and we have the blocks, and traditionally that's what we do. But we want to do more than that. We want to have small little spaces throughout the whole room. And the other thing we want to try and avoid is having all the tables in one part of the room. So all the tables are over here, but all the fun stuff's down here. So all the dramatic play stuff and all the, the paint and all that. That's not what we want. We want all of that intertwined so that the whole environment is a learning environment, and that's how it looks to the children, that's how it looks to the parents, and of course that's how it looks to the educator. That then keeps the educator on track to make sure that there's lots of learning experiences placed in these spaces that are all open-ended. And if you're listening, and you might have noticed that I never use the word activities, because an activity is something you put out on a table, the children do it, and you pack it up. And that's not what we're doing. We're not doing that in a brain set classroom. We are creating learning experiences. So we're setting up the tables, and we might leave them there for the same things on there for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, and just add things to it or take things away. But we set it up and we allow children the opportunity and means so that they can practice those skills and become really competent, confident, independent, responsible, resilient when things don't work, and they can try it again. So we're offering them an opportunity to create all of those beautiful human skills. And with that then comes the academic skills, because now they're confident to start counting things and start writing their name and start doing things like that. So when we have small defined spaces, children are feeling less threatened, they're more inclined to take a risk with their learning, they're more inclined to talk about it. And remember, we said before, as the facilitator, you're moving around asking all these great questions, or sometimes don't. As a facilitator, step back and just watch. See what's going on and observe the children, and then you know when to go in, who to help, who not to help. You can see the skills that are being developed, and you can just learn a lot just by getting out of the way, basically, and letting the children just do their thing. If you've got the environment set up well, that happens whether you're in it or whether you're not.
So what I'm hearing is this build-up towards the idea that a physical space and the relational space are actually inseparable. And this is exactly where trauma-informed practice actually also lives. We say that the educator is the environment, and that before a child can self-regulate, they need to co-regulate with an adult who is regulated. So the relationship is the first environment. So I wanted to ask, where do you see brain set and that idea intersecting? Because I think they're both saying the same thing, but just in two, parallel perspectives.
I think it's really important that we do firstly identify that relationships are very important with children, and it's not just the relationships with other human beings, so child to adult. It's actually a relationship with the environment. They need to fall in love with the environment, and then they fall in love with learning, basically. And the adults in the room and the other children in the room are part of that environment. But if we can make it a space where children feel safe, they feel connected, they know that it's a place where they can explore what they can do, and it's all accepted and it's all supported, and it's a good place to be. They will relax, and learning will just happen easily, and it happens through building those relationships. When I talk about the brain set planning process, the first thing I start with when I'm working with early childhood educators is I start with a term that I call child appreciation. And child appreciation isn't, are they right-handed, left-handed, can they write their name, do they know their colours, do they know the shapes? It's none of that. It's, are they funny? Do they have a sense of humour? Are they leaders? Are they followers? Do they like doing kind things? Do they like flowers? How do they cope with that baby of theirs that cries constantly? What do they do with their new little puppy? Do they feed the puppy? Do they look after the puppy? We want to know about the child themselves. Once we know about the child, then we can start looking at those developmental milestones and start looking at their interests that they might have, and then setting up our environment accordingly. And then we, reevaluate and we adapt and we extend and we do all of those great things in the planning process. But the first step is to have this child appreciation. Yeah. And that goes with what you were saying about these relational aspects. How do they relate to other people as well?
So here's the part where I imagine a lot of educators were nodding along, genuinely moved by what you were saying. But then they're probably also questioning, how do I make this happen? Because our field is full of beautiful ideas, let's be honest, and they don't really survive the contact with, staff meetings and budget conversations and overheads and things like that. And I think you and I both know that knowledge on its own doesn't shift practice. So BrainSet is structured as a training program, but then it's also followed by ongoing coaching and mentoring. So why do you insist on that long tail? Why isn't, a 1 hour or 1 day workshop enough?
Well, Dana, you and I have both been doing what we do for a long time, and we're both practical people. And we I think we've all had experiences of going to a conference, and it's really interesting. And you do the 1 hour workshop, and oh yeah, that sounds good. I totally agree with all of that. That sounds so interesting. Yeah, I'll do that when I'll go back into my room. But then it all just falls away over time. You end up just going back to what you were doing because there's pressures where you're working, there's expectations, there's the different challenges, maybe there's behaviour challenges, and so all of these things that seem like a really great idea when you're in the PD session or the conference, you just think, it's too hard, I can't do it. Or maybe you don't have the buy-in and the support of the people you're working with, or the buy-in or the support of the leadership team that you're working with, to the administrations. So there's a lot of aspects as to why it may not continue. So with BrainSet, so many people agree with it and say, oh yeah, it just makes perfect sense, it's so practical. And that's great, because I was a teacher for a long time and I want practical. I want things that I can do in my room. But I also feel that a one-off PD session isn't enough. We need to have some ongoing coaching, and we need to have a check-in with people, and they need to be able to access me and ask questions and send me photos and say, oh, I've set this up, but the children aren't going anywhere near it. And you're like, why not? And I've got several centres around the world that I work with, and that's what they do. They send me photos, and we have this conversation either on WhatsApp or via email or Google Meet or whatever we do, some sort of technology. And we have these ongoing coaching sessions, and it helps them to feel like they're not alone to start with, and it helps them to sort of bounce ideas around and also be part of a community, a BrainSet community, where we're all on the same page and we're all just doing the best we can and trying to make the biggest difference. Something else that I often say to them is, let's just make small but significant changes. So that just means turn your tables at an angle. That's a small change, but significant. It will change the way children are operating in the room, and it will change the way you see your room. Yesterday, when I was working in these classrooms, they had a big mat, and all I did was just pull the mat to the other side of the room, put it on an angle, and I got a set of shelves, but shelves that didn't have a back on them, so shelves that you could see through. Because again, for children who have experienced trauma, they feel safer when they can see through and they know what's on the other side of the shelf. Yeah. So I got one of those shelves and just put it, across the mat. Yeah. So the mat was on its angle, and I've just put it across. So now I've got two sides. Children can work here or children can work there, because the shelving system is breaking up that big space into two smaller spaces. That's a small but significant change. It can be that easy.
I love that. I love how, so we're going to walk into our classrooms, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get on our knees and we're going to view our classroom at children's level. I have this story that I've shared quite a few times, but I'll share it with you, which is that in my classroom, I always ensured that the artwork the children made was hung at their level. So it was quite annoying for me to have to duck down below the artwork about 2,000 times a day when I'm getting from one end to the other. But I also noticed parents were getting increasingly frustrated because they also had to duck down when they were dropping their children off. I remember this father once asking me very, very politely, because he didn't want to offend me, he was saying, "Don't you think this is in the way?" And I remember I was pausing, thinking, like, how do I answer him? Like, what should I say? Is this a sit-down conversation? But just as he said that, his child walked right under without being affected by the artwork, because it was hung in a way that this child could see it, but wasn't really, it wasn't in his way. And I said, well, it's not in his way. And I remember that opened up such a beautiful conversation between me and the father about how, when I was designing the space or the room, it was designed with his child in mind. Yes, there's me and there's our assistants in the room as well, and we also have to consider that, but the primary recipient of my room and the spatial design that I put in is targeting the child. And I think once we keep that in mind, everything else falls into place. And he never once asked again or looked annoyed when he had to go under the artwork, because I think he realized how important it was to have a space that was designed with his child in mind.
Yeah, that's really important that we think about it from the child's perspective. So that getting down on the knees is important. The wayfinding is important. The way you greet children in the morning is important. The way you start your day, having a visual timetable or a schedule so that it's predictable for children, so they can see what happens next. They can see what do we do after lunch. They know, because children don't wear a watch, so they've got no idea of what the time is. And it'd be the same as us going to work and just knowing that at some point we're going to go home, but we don't know what time, we don't know when lunchtime is, nothing, because it's under the control of somebody else. Yeah. So if we have a visual timetable so children can watch the day go past, that too adds to that lowering of that cortisol level and that predictability that you were speaking about before, Dana.
Exactly. So Dr. Kathryn, for an educator who's never heard of BrainSet before today, but has taken a lot away from this conversation, what's the very first thing you'd want them to do?
I think the very first thing that I would want them to do is nothing. Just observe. Step back and observe and see what's going on in your room. See where the areas are that children tend to go more than other places. Think about your learning intentions. What are you wanting the children to do? What are the skills that you want these children to be developing? And have you set up spaces to allow them to develop these skills and practice these skills and practice them over and over? Yeah. So I think my first suggestion would be just step back and just watch, just observe to start with, and then start thinking about some small but significant changes.
Right. I think if I had to share, Dr. Kathryn, what this conversation confirmed to me was something that I come back to again and again in this work. It's that the conditions that children need to learn are not separate from the conditions they need to feel human. So safety before thinking, we know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can see it, visualize it, and we know what we need to make it happen. So that also involves connection coming before compliance, and a room saying that you belong before the lesson begins. What Kathryn has built with BrainSet is a framework that takes those truths and translates them into the physical worlds. And what I hope you're taking away today is that the room you are designing and the presence that you bring to that room are not two different parts of your job. They're actually the same job and asking the same questions. What does this child's brain need to come home to itself, to feel safe? That's the work, and it starts with you knowing the answer. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for this conversation. I think everything that we talked about is going to stay with me for a while.
Thank you, Dana. It's always lovely to chat with you and share with you and your audience. So thank you for the invitation.
Of course. If you want to explore Kathryn's work, you can find her at Future Strong Education. All the links are in the show notes, including where to learn more about the BrainSet Environments formula. And if this episode resonates with you, I would love to know. Share it with a colleague, tag us when you do, and if there's a topic you want us to dig into, reach out. This podcast exists because of this community. Until next time, on behalf of everyone at the Early Years Academy, by Parent App, the Early Years Podcast, thank you and take care.